Story challenge. A horror story that will scare the shit out of me. Everyone knows that the more legs something has, the creepier it is. Spiders? They're one of the most common fears. Centipedes and millipedes? Well, they can go fuck themselves, because their names are a lie. But what about the dreaded comipede, which actually lives up to its name? Haven't heard of it? You're about to. Jimothy considered himself a fairly brave person. He wasn't afraid to drive 34 in a 30 zone. He put both sugar and salt in his popcorn. He even put his pronouns on his social media, which we all know is the bravest thing a person can do. Yes, it's fair to say that Jimothy was a big dick player. Which is why, when Jimothy signed up for a jungle trek through the Peruvian jungle, he assumed there was nothing he couldn't handle. Of course, when you assume, you make my arse into... You take the arse of... You know what I mean. Upon arriving in Peru, Jimothy was greeted by his guide, Alejandro, number 1 on a list of Peruvian names for baby boys, and escorted to the jeep which would take them to the jungle border. Jimothy would be sharing his quest with an American couple and a German woman. Jimothy was from England. More on that later. "So, Americans," said Alejandro, yelling passionately from the front seat. "You are all very fat, yes?" The Americans chuckled. "Not all," said one of them, "but certainly a lot, Alejandro." "And Mrs. Germany, Hitler and Nazis and stuff, eh?" Sure," said the German. "And Mr. Englishman, conquering a quarter of the world and forcing the native populations to adopt your lifestyle, yes?" "Wait a minute," said Jimothy. "Why was mine so much more detailed?" "Ah, we are almost there," said Alejandro, ignoring Jimothy's question. Jimothy groaned. He resolved to spend the next 4 days thinking about a suitable comeback to his guide's insult. The problem was, he knew absolutely nothing about Peru. It was one of those countries where you say, "Oh yeah, near Brazil, right?" Or, "Do they speak Spanish or Portuguese there?" It was, in short, the Serbia of South America. "And here we go," said Alejandro. He stood with his back to the trees, bouncing slightly up and down like a stuck NPC. "Before we enter the jungle, some safety rules." He suddenly grew serious. "Rule 1. Always stay on the path. If you leave the path, we will not look for you. Is that clear?" The tourist nodded. "Good. Rule 2. If you are bitten by a comipede, we will abandon you. And rule 3, have fun. Okay, everybody ready? Let's go." "Hold on," said the German lady. "She'll be dead soon, so don't worry about her name. What was the second rule again?" "Ah, no worries. Just that if you are bitten by a comipede, we will leave you behind." "Okay, time to move, guests." "But what's a comipede?" said the American man. His name is also not important. Alejandro chuckled. "It's just a little very big bug which is very dangerous. Don't panic, Mr. Fat American. We have a saying here. Hakuna Matata, which means no problems." He turned and trudged into the jungle. "Pretty sure it's no worries," the American mumbled, as he took his wife's hand and they followed after their guide. The German woman exchanged a glance with Jimothy, shrugged, and walked towards the trees. Jimothy hesitated. He was suddenly not so confident about Alejandro's skills as a guide. The advert he had seen had been so convincing too. It had said, "Super cheap guided tours for special customers want see Peru jungle, yes okay?" Jimothy reminded himself that he had a massive set of balls and they would surely protect him. He pulled out a hiking pole which he had bought at the airport and strode confidently after the foreigners. The group had been walking for a couple of hours, with Alejandro occasionally pointing at a tree and shouting something, such as, "Look at those birds, they are called the tree chicken. No, Americans, you cannot eat them." Then he would laugh to himself and carry on. Jimothy was only half paying attention. He had his nose buried in a guidebook he had bought at the airport. He stopped and said, "Hey, Alejandro, Peru, many of your presidents have been in jail for corruption, hey?" He looked up smugly. The smugness quickly evaporated. He had wandered from the path. His head darted in every direction, but he could see no sign of his companions. "Alejandro," he cried. Americans. German." He waited, but no response came. He was alone. "Don't panic," he mumbled to himself. "Just think. What did Alejandro say?" Alejandro's voice popped into his head. "If you leave the path, we will not look for you." "Shit," said Jimothy. His breathing quickened. He could feel his heart smashing against his chest. Suddenly every sound was enhanced. The rustle of leaves, the calls of birds and chirpings of insects. Every movement was a potential attacker. "Alejandro!" he yelled at the top of his lungs. Branches shook as several close-by birds took flight. Jimothy pulled out a small knife he had bought at the airport. He had bought a lot of things at the airport, and placed his back to a tree. When the moss and rough bark scraped against his t-shirt, Jimothy had an idea. "I'll climb a tree. That's what they do in the films." He pulled out a complete set of climbing equipment he had bought at the airport and rigged himself up. With many grunts, scrapes, and curses, Jimothy successfully hauled his body up the trunk until he sat just below the tree canopy. He pushed past a branch packed with leaves and gasped. The forest expanded for miles in every direction, an endless sea of green that shifted like water with every movement of air. "Wow," said Jimothy. It was beautiful, but terrifying. He pulled out a set of binoculars he had bought at the airport and scanned the horizon in every direction. Some unnatural movement caught his eye. Several trees were rustling, one at a time, in one specific direction. Something big was moving them as it passed. It had to be his companions. He thought he could even hear Alejandro's smooth voice on the wind. Jimothy memorized the direction, rushed down the tree and took off. Using a compass he had bought at the airport, he managed to keep a straight path until he heard the Peruvian's voice ahead. "Alejandro!" he called. The far-off voice ceased. Then, after a pause, "Mr. Englishman?" "Stay where you are," called Jimothy. "I'm coming." He ran faster than he had ever done in his life, shoving his body through bushes, leaping over fallen trees, until after a minute the crew came into sight. "Thank heavens," he wheezed as he panted heavily. The Americans and German looked shocked. Alejandro was laughing. "You are crazy, hey, Mr. Englishman? Your people only average in most of the sports they invented, yes?" "Your insults are very specific," said Jimothy, panting. "I told you, stay on path," said Alejandro. "Jungle too big to—" He trailed off. Jimothy looked up at him. The Peruvian's joy had turned to horror. He followed his guide's gaze to a point behind him. Something gigantic was crawling towards them, weaving between the trees. "Dios mío," whispered Alejandro. "Don't move. If it sees your fancy plastic equipment, it will attack." "Why can't we just—" "Wait, what?" said the American woman. "It is attracted to your things. Try to look poor." "Try to look poor," said the American man. "What strange advice. I'm not some tree-hugging Democrat." He froze as the creature passed through a path of sunlight, and its horridness was truly revealed. The creature was an insect, larger than any Jimothy had ever seen. Its mandibles were as long as his forearm. Its shiny red body was as wide as his head. Every one of its dozens of pointy legs made a dent in the jungle floor as it crept towards them. Is that a comipede?" asked the German woman. "Take them!" Alejandro suddenly cried. "I am a poor man. My father fought alongside Che." The American man pulled out a shiny handgun which he had bought at the airport. "What is this nonsense?" He aimed the gun towards the creature's head. "This should stop the bars." "Ah!" The giant insect had lunged towards the American's outstretched arm, sinking its mandibles deep into his flesh. In the struggle, he fired his gun. It grazed the insect, which hissed and released the arm. It retreated several feet, then began crawling in a circle around the group. The American man was writhing on the floor. His skin turned red. His eyes grew bloodshot. "Husband!" the American woman cried, as she knelt next to him and tried to hold him still. "It is too late," said Alejandro. "There is no going back now. See, he is already changing." "Changing into what?" the American woman asked, desperation in her voice. Her husband grew still. Then, without warning, he sat up and cried out. "Revolution!" he said. "What's that, dear?" his wife said. "We must lift the working class up, free them from their struggle with the bourgeoisie." "Oh God," said his wife. "It can't be." "I'm afraid so," said Alejandro. "He is a communist now." Dun dun dun. The American woman began to weep, as her husband continued to rant about his misguided social philosophy. "Is there no cure?" she asked. Alejandro shook his head. He picked up the American's gun and pointed it at the American's head. "It is better this way," he said. "Then he won't suffer." The American woman held up her hand. "Wait, I'll do it." She stood up and took the gun, then pointed it at her deluded husband's head. You'll go to heaven, dear, she said, beginning to sob. Won't that be nice? Lovely capitalist heaven. Before the American man could reply, his wife pulled the trigger. While all of this had been happening, the Commipede had also bitten the German woman. She was muttering about plans to rebuild the Berlin Wall when the American woman shot her too. The Commipede grew angry. It did not like to see its ideological parasite stopped in its tracks like this before it had a chance to spread. It lunged at the American woman, biting off her arm. Both the arm and the gun it held dropped to the ground. The Commipede flicked them into the jungle with its legs and began wrapping its body around the American. As it dragged her away, Jimothy knew he had to make a quick decision. It's worth a life, he said. He pulled out a bazooka that he had bought at the airport, took aim, and fired at the insect's head. The creature exploded, along with the American woman, and Jimothy and Alejandro were thrown back. They were showered with human and insect gore for several long seconds as they laid still. After a while, Alejandro groaned and sat up. As he wiped Commipede flesh from his clothes, he said, "That will attract more of them. We have to leave." "There are more?" Jimothy asked as he shook himself clean. "Always. The struggle never ends, Mr. Englishman. Do you have anything in the bag to get us away?" "Yes, I think so," said Jimothy. He rummaged around and finally pulled out a helicopter he had bought at the airport. He and Alejandro climbed in the front seats and they rose out of the trees, slicing branches away as they climbed. Jimothy glanced below and saw at least a dozen Commipedes crawling around the area they had just left. "How do we beat them?" Jimothy asked. "It is not easy to resist poison of such a deadly parasite," said Alejandro. "But one way is, not be a stupid fucking idiot."